With all the money printing that's going on right now, are we at risk of seeing hyperinflation in our country today and throughout the world?
A couple of weeks ago, Reuters came out with a research report from their London office totaling all of the stimulus that has been put out there in the system by the governments around the world. And it says, and they came up with a number of about $15 trillion and counting in global stimulus so far. Well, I have a question. Will the $15 trillion and counting in global stimulus that's been promised cause hyperinflation? And another way to ask the same question is, which is more likely that we will face a deflationary environment or a hyperinflationary environment? Because that's the other side of the coin. I want you to think about this like a teeter-totter. When it comes to money and inflation, that's when the value of our money becomes less valuable than another country's money. So they become more valuable, we become less valuable in comparison to their money. So if they print more money and we print about the same amount of money comparatively, then effectively no one prints any money and it creates a zero-sum game. So we effectively have a scenario where the dollar and other currencies become worth still about the same as they were before if we're all printing money together at the same time. So we're going to dive into this a little bit later to find out really what that means in our economy and what's really happening when we're printing all this money at the same time other countries are doing the same thing. But let's look first at what the top 5 countries have printed so far. The USA in blue, you can see what the central bank has promised and actually implemented in stimulus from quantitative easing. And then in orange is where we have the actual dollars that have been promised through fiscal stimulus or government stimulus, where they're sending money to companies or people to help stabilize the economy and put it back into growth mode. And as you can see, in the United States, we've had over $5 trillion between what the Federal Reserve has done and what the government has done. And we're going to update some of the charts that we had last week, but this is the effective dollar amount of all of the other global economies around the world. And another way to look at this, though, is the value of that stimulus compared to the GDP or the gross domestic product that those countries have produced over that same time frame. So in Japan, they have actually printed about 21% of last year's economy in new stimulus this year. And the United States, we've done so far about 11% in stimulus compared to what we did last year as a country in growth and total sales. So let's look at what happened last year with GDP and compare that to where we are right now with the stimulus. In 2019, we had about $21.5 trillion in GDP. And last quarter, we lost about 4.8%, or the equivalent of about $1 trillion worth of our economy that was lost due to the economic shutdowns that we experienced in the first quarter of 2020. And so far, the stimulus that we've passed, I've updated this to now $5 trillion, and that includes both the fiscal and Federal Reserve stimulus. And if we take that $1 trillion that we lost last quarter, the stimulus lifeline that we have remaining is about $3.9 trillion, or effectively another 17% of the GDP of our country. And that includes the Federal Reserve stimulus. And that's what's different about this slide from last week to this week, is that we are now including both the fiscal and Federal Reserve stimulus, or the government spending and the Federal Reserve spending in this number. And we effectively have almost 20% of our economy still in backup money that has been promised or has already been spent to help stimulate where our country is going right now. So what's actually happening then is that we have a massive forced redistribution of wealth in our country. And this is a major problem for us because it will happen slowly as taxes are raised on the rich and the poor alike to help pay for all the bills that we've now accumulated as a country to try and recover and build our way out of our big problem. So Japan's been printing money since the late 1990s and kept interest rates at zero for 30 years. In fact, in the 1990s, Japan attempted 9 stimulus packages that totaled the equivalent of $1.3 trillion. They haven't experienced hyperinflation, and we won't either. This is a graph of the inflation rate for Japan since the early 1980s. And as you can see, in the mid to late 80s and early 90s, Japan had a pretty strong inflation rate. But as soon as they hit about the mid 90s, those stimulus packages stopped working and they eventually started hitting this deflationary period where they no longer had inflation. They actually lost ground for over 15 years before they started to make it back up again and see any kind of inflation again. Now let's compare that to the United States. If we draw the United States graph over that same time frame, we have experienced a fairly steady rate of inflation over that same time frame, with the exception of the financial crisis, which is this area right here between 2007 and 2009, where we saw some slight deflationary pressure. My expectation is that now we're going to see that again in our economy, where we're going to see this deflationary pressure again. However, I think the difference is that we will probably look a lot more like Japan this go around, because we have so many baby boomers that are exiting the workforce and have already exited the workforce, as well as the compounded deaths that we've seen over the last several months from the coronavirus, on top of our regular death rate that we have in our country. So the likelihood of us experiencing deflation like Japan is much, much higher. So my conclusion is that it's more likely that we are going to experience a mild to moderate deflationary pressure for the next 7 to 10 years while our economy recovers and our demographics transition back into a growth cycle. Thank you so much for joining us this week. I hope it's been helpful. Please don't forget to hit the subscribe button and like the video if this was helpful, and share it with a friend. Really appreciate you guys, and we'll see you next week. Thanks.